Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's Conservation on Tap. We're here at the Okavango Craft Brewery, which is supporting this initiative, so please feel free to enjoy their delicious beverages as you're listening to the discussion. I'm Emily Bennett from the Okavango Research Institute, and I've been organising these panel discussions for the last 6 months, and we're supported by Quando Safaris. This month we're talking about fire. We're going to give you some information from some experts that know all about the processes around fire, particularly in the Okavango Delta, but this does apply to various ecosystems. So enjoy. So we have here James Bradley and Lynn Cassidy, both of which have done some work on fire and have a lot of information. So we're going to start with them giving you some information about fire, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. We're also obviously supported by the brewery, who's providing us with this lovely venue. Thank you. So without further ado, I will pass over to our lovely panelists who have some slides. I hope you can see them past the trees.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Cassidy, just in case you thought I was James Bradley. But yes, in the absence of fire experts, we are the people who've probably done the most recent research on fire. And it's not big stuff, but it's really actually quite interesting. So I'm going to start with some of the outputs from this research paper that we worked on. But I know that their biggest interest is in what's happening in the Delta. So I've tried to modify some of the presentation to kind of focus more on the Delta area. But before I do that, let's just leap straight in. So when I put this slide up and thought about fire in the Delta, I thought, you think we've got problems in the Delta? So this is a picture of how many years a particular piece of the landscape burned in the last 20 years. And you can see that our neighbors, this is a Caprivi strip. Oh, nerves. Caprivi strip, Angola, can't point through the cushion, are huge concerns. Also, this particular area here of Chobe National Park, and that's tremors that you're seeing there, and the forest reserve, looks like it's burning far more frequently than the Okavango Delta. I think it brings it back to a question of, where do fires occur and why do they occur? So in Namibia and Angola, what we're seeing is probably a lot of slash and burn agriculture, crop production that is happening because people, firstly, that there's enough biomass for them to do. We can't really do that in Botswana because we don't have anything left at the end of winter to burn, pretty much. But what's also really interesting in this image is not just where has burned and where has burned frequently, but also where has not burned. So again, if we look, we can follow river channels. They don't burn because they're too wet, but also developed areas. So this is the ring of circulation. There is a loop road that goes in Caprivi Strip where all the villages are, and it's too bare to burn. So then in Botswana, we've got some patches of places where it has not burned at all in the last 20 years. Which I find really interesting because we expect some fires to start by lightning, but obviously lightning strikes aren't, sort of happening everywhere on the landscape. We'll get to the question of timing of fires as well, but pretty much what you're seeing is human or anthropogenic burning on the landscape. This area on the prevailing wind direction makes a big difference. So we know that most of our wind, particularly in the dry season, comes from the east. So the fires always there's a hard line on the eastern edge and fires burning towards the west. You can see a lot of features. There's this linear feature here, which is the cut line between, that goes down this part of CH1, Chobe Enclave, all the way down here. Lots of places that are either points of ignition for human access. Anyway, just to give you the context that, yes, we're worried about fire in the Okavango, but compared to a lot of other places, there's not much happening. I also wanted to talk a bit about the what burns. And so this is a very coarse map of different vegetation types. So the dark green are the sort of Baikya woodlands. The light green is what we think of as the Mopani regions. The pale blue is the grasslands. As I say, it's very coarse. And then the beige color is the acacia woodlands. And the reason I wanted to show you that is that when you look at you overlay the fires, you can see which types of ecosystems are burning a lot. So it is those Baikya woodlands in the dark green in the north of the country. And then also we've got quite a bit happening in the Okavango as well. Got too many ways to click on here. Anyway, are fires getting worse over time? A lot of people are concerned that more and more is burning. So I did my master's on fire in the Okavango because I read in the 1976 symposium on the Okavango Delta, one of the first symposiums held, that 75% of the Okavango burned every year, and that was back in the 70s. It's like, whoa, that's a lot. So I chose a small section and had a look to see how that looked for one given year. But certainly it wasn't 75% the year I looked. This is just a qualitative kind of overview. You can't actually, I haven't measured, is there more burned area in the first 10 years between 2001 and 2010 compared to the next 10 years between 2011 and 2020. But intuitively, it doesn't look like there is much difference at the broad landscape level. There are little hotspots. Something is going on here on the buffalo fence. And this concession area here seems to have always had a big problem. Luckily, I'm not very good at remembering CHAs. So anyway, that's just that kind of way of looking at things. But I know most of you want to know how much of the delta actually burns. So these maps don't cover all of the delta. As you saw in that in fact, I'll flick back quickly. Right at the bottom of this image, you can see a straight white line, right? So my footprint doesn't capture right this bottom half here of the imagery. So it's not a perfect way to kind of calculate what's going on, but for the purposes of this talk, I thought I would just see what I can try and figure out based on this data set. And then also, what do we mean by how much of the delta burns? So we could look at it in terms of the Okavango WMA, because that's a broad scale management zone, or we could look at it by active wetland area. And I sort of imagine that we could look at it in terms of the 2011 flood extent. The challenge with that is, or the differences there, is that when you look at just wetland, it might reduce what burns, because a lot of the Okavango WMA is, ecologically, it's sort of savannas, and maybe some of the fires are there. So those are just some of the ways that one could try and figure out how much of the delta burns, because it's not such a straightforward question. So in the end, I decided not to crop it by wetland area, mostly to do with time. But just to give you an overview, on the right-hand side, you can see the flood extent, which is pretty much the largest flood extent we've had in recent history, and certainly within the time frame of this fire analysis that we did. And you can sort of visually compare, flicking back and forth. And then I decided to also say, okay, let's pick up what I call the wet CHAs. And so it's not just the Okavango WMA, but I picked up a couple of other CHAs as well. And I don't know if you can see this red outline very clearly. So I included the NG12 and the panhandle into what would otherwise be the Okavango WMA. And that's what I decided to crop the data set to and try and figure out what % of the landscape burns. And it's actually quite interesting. So there's the crop. And then we simply count up the pixels. We could convert it into square kilometers, but again, I had work commitments. But I can tell you that 36% of the delta did not burn on a measurable extent. So there might have been tiny little fires that didn't get picked up by the satellite imagery at all in the last 20 years. And then a further 24% only burnt once. So the proportion of the landscape that is burning perhaps too frequently is tiny. And how often the delta burns on an annual basis probably isn't really the problem. That's not what is concerning to us. Really, what is concerning to us, I think, is timing of burning. And just to kind of give you another angle on this. So on the left-hand side, how much of the Okavango burned in 2011? Well, the flood was high, so there wasn't actually that much space for fires to go to. And that's a comparison of how much burnt just visually in 2011, which is the highest flood in recent years, compared with how much burnt in 2019, which was the driest year in recorded history. So you can see there's these drastic differences, and there's this very close relationship between how wet the delta is and how much can actually burn. But it's also really interesting if you compare the 2019 burn area with this image here. You can see that it's burning in a wetland area and not in the dry lands. So then we get to the question of timing. And I don't know how well you can see here because the color scheme is a bit pale. What this does is it breaks down the data set to say how many times did the Okavango burn in January in the last 20 years, how much in February in the last 20 years, how much in March in the last 20 years, to get a sense of which month is the most kind of common time that people are burning. Because if these were lightning fires, they would mostly be occurring in September and October, when vegetation, typically, I know it's flooded, so it's not always that wet anyway. But lightning fires are associated with the onset of the raining season and when vegetation is still dry. So we're seeing a lot of fires in the Delta happening, sorry, not very good at this, in March, April. May is a very big one, and that's why we're having this talk now, because it's on everybody's mind. Like, what is happening? And why are we seeing these vast extents of fires happening? It burns every month, but less so in the dry season when you might expect it and when it starts burning in the surrounding dry land. So in September, for example, bottom right, we see north of the Delta, a lot of fires starting there, but less so in the southern part because by now the flood is down in any case. So there are these aseasonal fires that are happening. So that's basically what those data sets that we have. I've also got some information on that I did. This is actually from my master's thesis. There's a lot of reasons why people burn, and there are a lot of good reasons why we burn. There's a tendency to kind of worry that fire is generally a bad thing. But fire has been a tool for managing the environment for a long, long time. And so there are all of these reasons that people have burned for all across the world. In Botswana, we don't actually have slash and burn. And most of our fires, as you've seen from those maps, tend to be set in savannas, and they're related to range management in the broadest sense. So that could be managing wildlife movement or managing livestock. What we're seeing more recently, particularly in the Delta, and you can tell by the location of some of the hotspots, is that the burning is being associated with the tourism industry. So this might just be a guide or someone not doing it officially, but wanting to make their life easily. Because if you burn an area, and for those of you who are staying in town, if you drive over Riley's Bridge and have a look at that burn, how quickly it's greening up now that the flood has arrived, you will recognize quite how quickly a burned area can respond and produce attractive vegetation that's attractive to both game and livestock. So in the tourism industry, you make it more visible, and you remove old grass and attract animals in. So yep, we've got lots of reasons. Sometimes it's good or sometimes it's bad. Burning inside the delta itself is also done by people who are collecting thatching grass and reeds, because walking on that old stubble, it's really hard, and also the kind of grass and reeds you want to collect, you want the newer shoots and not the old ones. So people have had these traditional reasons to burn for a long, long time. When we turn to traditional management of fire, prior to independence, there were actually a lot of good reasons or good ways in which people kind of decided when they would burn. So people looked at when. They had an idea of, we can't burn until winter. Burning earlier was not good. And this was not just because of things like letting the thatching grass drop its seeds so that there would be seeds for the next year round, but also there was this recognition of poorer households who didn't have access, whether they had to wait until a neighbor had finished collecting so they could borrow the mokoro to go and collect. But poorer households, everyone had to have a chance to get the resources that they need before they were burned. There were times when chiefs, village headmen would say, we're not going to burn at all because we've noticed that last year's rain was not good enough or something like that. And then also location, there were rules. People were supposed to be on guard and manage that the fire did not spread. And they were never supposed to burn in the same year 2 years running, in the same place 2 years running. And also they had to protect species that were of interest to the community. But then, of course, with independence, we got common law and new rules, including making fire illegal, pushing it underground. That's just some of the laws here. But what I find really interesting is that the reasons that people stopped burning came out of a temperate ecosystem like Europe and the UK, where people were burning and the fire regimes there are very, very different. The European settlers had reason to say that fire was bad, but they were not familiar with an African or savanna context. So even before independence, the influence of European settlers was to encourage fire suppression completely. This is changing. We have got a new wildland fire management policy. It's not fully adopted as far as I know, and I'm sorry that our missing person was the forestry fire coordinator, Mr. Ditapo, who is working on these issues as well as on community-based fire management. But this new policy does acknowledge that complete suppression is a problem, and that we need to work with local communities. Is fire good or bad? The answer is always, it depends. It depends on why you're burning. But more importantly, when we worry about fires, it's not should the place burn or not, it's when it should burn. And that's in relation to rain, to wind, to where plants are in their life cycle, and those kind of things. And can we manage the extent? It's very, very challenging in remote areas on a windy day to stop a fire from spreading. So these are some of the challenges on whether we should burn or not. It also depends on whether you're in a savanna or a wetland, and it comes back to this issue, so what's happening in the delta? We know that savannas are fire-created systems. And there are lots of ways that we do look at managing them now, such as starting to burn early in winter rather than late, because things are green enough that you can control their spread. But with the delta, there's so much that we don't know. All we know is that these interactions with the flood pulse size, also how much could grow because of the previous year's flood. And we also know how devastating it can be when you have these extreme conditions like we did in 2019 when it dried up so much that we had these bad peat fires. So what we're seeing in terms of management in the Delta is that fires are set way too early, and we don't know what is going on. We don't know if it's changing vegetation composition, or is it more just that it's changing the vegetation structure. We don't know if it's having impacts on ground breeding. Now, one of the stories that people talk about is with early fires. If you've got birds, endangered species like wattle crane that are ground breeding birds, if there's an early season fire, that might take out the next generation of wattle cranes. And there's also increasing conflict between different people using environment, whether that's the tourism sector versus livestock people, or whether it's within communities. And the people who suffer most from that are actually the poor and vulnerable households. So I think now I really am going to pass on to James, because I've talked enough. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Lynn. I think you've earned a good drink of your stout there. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not. I haven't studied fire extensively. I've worked a little bit by studying it, and I think Lynn is certainly far more knowledgeable. There are other people in this town that are far more knowledgeable than us. But I think what's important to recognize is that when we see fire, we always see it as being an incredibly destructive force. And we worry about it. We worry about the impacts that it has, and perhaps now with an increasing anthropogenic influence, new developments, expansion of the human range, especially within northern Botswana, we're starting to see greater impacts upon our lives and the developments that we build. But the landscape of northern Botswana, as well as southern Africa, is for years, for millennia, has been shaped by water, by herbivory, by fire, be it through Paleo Lake Makgadikgadi, the Okavango Delta, the movement of large herbivores across the landscape. Fire contributes to that, and it's contributed to the landscape that we see today. More recently, anthropogenic developments have caused those problems, as Lynn showed through on those maps. We haven't specifically looked at done an assessment of the correlation, but there's quite clear patterns that show up, certainly on the Chobe side, where there's hard edges, the landscape. We as humans are a significant influence and a significant contributor to those fires. Areas that you can specifically look at, for instance, this is NG43. This whole area here is incredibly sparsely utilized by an incredibly sparsely human activity within that landscape. It hasn't burnt for 20 years. Also, you can look at the eastern side of Moremi Game Reserve, where there is extensive human activity. But again, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of mobile movement, there's a lot of self-drive movement through that area. And it's, in a way, it's a relative dry land. There is water going through there, but it hasn't burnt. So it's just very interesting to see that human impact. This Chobe hard line, that is the road that runs from Ngoma through to Kasane. The area south of it has burnt, the area north of it, which is heavily utilized, has not. Likewise, coming down here, the Chobe Kasane to Nata road, there's a very hard edge there in terms of where the fires are starting. But as I say, we generally consider that fires, human nature, we look at fires as being a destructive force, but they can actually have a very positive effect. They remove moribund biomass, promote fresh growth, and restrict bush encroachment. And certainly within woodland savannas, the fire and herbivory helps to maintain a balance between the woody and the grass biomass. Immediately following a fire, grass regrowth is quick. Generally, you start to see fresh green shoots within 2 to 3 days of the fire passing through. But it can take 2 to 3 years for a burnt area for the quantity of forage within that area to equal an unburnt area, to equal what it was prior to the fire. Equally, the forage quality is significantly higher in burnt areas. Nutrient concentrations can be significantly higher for up to 3 months immediately following a fire, and then gradually diminishing, which is again comes into the timing of the fire. If a fire is set and burns August, September, 2 to 3 months before the onset of the rainy season, it should be absolutely fine. The forage quality is significantly higher, and then the rains come in and encourage it and promotes growth. Equally, you see along the river, we've seen all the fires along the river, and again, you look at it and you go, that's terrible. But the flood is just coming in. The water, those grasslands, floodplains around the river, they're actually promoting growth. It should be a very positive thing. I'm not condoning the burning of those things, but I'm just saying it's not actually as bad as you might think. In terms of the ecology of how those burnt areas are used, large herbivores prefer to use burnt areas more than unburnt, but there are consequences. Certain species such as zebras, which need bulk grazing, they may struggle to find enough forage to fill up their stomachs. So therefore a patch mosaic of burnt and unburnt landscape is deemed to be more preferable. But what do we actually know here in northern Botswana? What do we know about fires? The reality is very little. There hasn't been any detailed, extensive studies done across the landscape. The most key study that we often refer to is from 1992. That's 30 years ago. During that study, they identified that a 5 to 7 year interval was preferable to limit tree loss across the landscape. Similar research conducted in northern Namibia, again, looked at an interval of give or take 10 years, and natural tree species such as the mukwa and other the larger, longer growing species, they need 5 to 7 years for those seedlings to get established, to be able to withstand the fires that pass through. So the areas which are burning far more frequently, certainly northern into the Zambezi province, southern Angola, Zambia, as Lynn showed on the map earlier, those areas are really going to struggle for regeneration and regrowth of those woodlands that are growing in those areas. I'm just very quickly going to take us away from the Delta a little bit. So some of you will know that I did my PhD research in the Makgadikgadi far too long ago now. But back in 2010, I was studying zebras across the Makgadikgadi landscape. In early September 2010, a fire was started just up here in the areas south of Gweta in the communal farmland areas. A farmer was burning one of his fields or burning a grassland to try to promote growth, to create vegetation, forage for his cattle. And as anybody who's been to the Makgadikgadi in August and September will tell you, that the winds can howl through there. And on the specific day that he set the fire, the winds picked up and they took that fire and they just kept it going. That went across the 30-meter wide cut line that runs down the eastern edge of the Makgadikgadi, and it ripped through the whole of the Makgadikgadi National Park. It ripped through the grasslands, through the acacia scrublands, all the way through to the Beteti in the space of about 48 hours. And again, obviously in 2010, we'd had a couple of years of very good rains. So there was an awful lot of standing biomass. There's an awful lot of fuel for that fire. So within 48 hours, 89% of the zebra's dry season home range burnt. Again, if people aren't aware, so during the dry season, zebras are reliant upon the water resources along the Beteti River on the western side of the Makgadikgadi National Park. So they basically forage within 25 to 30 kilometers of those water resources. So this purple polygon was basically their dry season home range. So within 48 hours, 89% of their dry season home range had burnt. After the fire, forage quality was significantly improved once it started growing. So within 2 to 3 days, fresh growth started coming through. It was obviously a little bit of a time period where forage availability was a little bit short, but very quickly forage quality started coming in, but the forage quantity was significantly lower. Crude protein levels in the grasses were significantly higher though. Zebra responded by increasing their time within their forage area. They increased the size of their forage area, and they increased the distance that they traveled away from the Boteti River. They also adjusted their fine-scale foraging behavior. Obviously, when you're in a thick, tall grassland, zebra puts its head down, it can stand in one place, graze from 2 or 3 different tufts over the course of 20, 30 seconds before taking the next step and carrying on. With no big tufts there, it literally taking a step, bite, step, bite, step, bite, step, bite, just constantly on the move. So it increased the time that they were actually moving. And by rapidly adjusting their behavior, they were very quickly able to respond to the fire and adjust to the changes in forage quantity and quality. Because of the lack of quantity of forage available, I did record them eating burnt stubble as well as the ash and stuff, just to try and fill their stomach a little bit to go with the fresh green growth. But what do we know about what is going to happen going forwards in terms of fires? Across southern Africa, the projections are that wildfires are likely to get worse as southern Africa gets hotter and drier across this century due to the impacts of climate change. Extreme rainfall events lead to increased biomass levels, increased fuel loads, which then burn faster and burn hotter. And too many hot, dry fires can drive large-scale ecological changes across the landscape. In the terms of Botswana and in northern Botswana, this results in an opening of the tree canopy, a reduction in the total available trees, an increase in certain fire and elephant-resistant shrubs such as Dicrostachys cinerea, sickle bush, as we know, and various other species like that. So it's hard to project and know exactly how things are going to change. But the loss of woodland leads to increased grassland availability, loss of biodiversity, a reduced carbon sequestration from the landscape, increasing temperature energy fluctuations at the surface of the landscape, which contribute to changing in the energy in the landscape, and decreased resilience of that landscape to climate change. So it's, as I say, we don't know for certain exactly what's going to happen. The projections of what's happening with climate change indicate that this is the path that we're going to move down, and it makes it even more important that we try to understand what is actually going on. And that I'm going to hand back to Lynn, or I'm handing over to Emily.
Thank you. That was, well, I found it very informative. And I think there's a lot of what we've seen in our previous talks about how diversity, variation, heterogeneity is important, in that fire can be good, but if it doesn't happen everywhere all the time. So I've got a slide that I've never seen. We decided to do this conservation on tap topic at this point because a lot of people are worried about fire. A lot of people were asking about fire, and we've decided to respond to that. And so Lynn and Mike Murray Hudson and I are preparing going to ask for money to launch a project looking at fire in the Delta, basically to address some of the questions that were raised this evening. Why are fires being set? What are the perceived benefits? What are the potential costs? and what are the consequences in terms of biodiversity, in terms of livelihoods, functioning, sorry, and how all of this relates to climate change. So we do have some, as we've seen tonight, we've got some examples of when fires are being set. I'm sure a lot of you have ideas about why they're being set in particular areas. And so what we'd like to do is actually try to understand what's happening at the moment, what stakeholders are doing, if they're actively setting fires, repressing fires, managing fires, and how that's going. And we also want to involve people. So we'd like to interact with a lot of stakeholders and ask them to help us to collect information, whether it's providing information about fire management, whether it's providing information from pilots, for example, about where they see fires, whether it's going out to a fire that was close to a camp or a settlement and taking photos regularly just to see what happens afterwards, document the regrowth. So we are trying to respond to something that's been articulated as a need. So we'll be reaching out. The deadline for this upcoming grant is end of July. So we will be reaching out. If you're interested, happy to work with you. If anyone actually wants to be involved, then please come and talk to us. And we're happy to involve as many stakeholders as we can. What we want to do is design a project that meets a need. So we need to talk to people about what that need is. Anyone have any questions for these lovely panelists? Questions, opinions? So the question was, do we have any information about the impact of fire on the water itself in terms of nutrients and total dissolved solids? Mike? Mike Murray Hudson, everybody, our resident expert in everything.
What I always say, we don't know. There's very little evidence that fire affects life under the water. It's a very fleeting phenomenon as far as aquatic life is concerned. It just flashes over the top, burns all its edges, and in general terms, all of the nutrients in that plant material are mineralized and can be dissolved in the water. And so sometimes you see a few more unicellular algae in floodplains that were burnt before they were flooded. And in general terms, I think that some research that we did indicated that, in fact, dissolved oxygen levels were much higher in burnt floodplains than they were in floodplains which hadn't been burnt. So we haven't seen anything that says, oh, the fire is killing all the life under the water. And in fact, it seems to be almost the opposite. I think that observation is reflected in multiple places across the globe. In the Pantanal, for example, they also don't see problems with fire for aquatic life. They, like us, often see big problems with dissolved oxygen for aquatic life, but that's mostly to do with the flushing up of organic matter on the rising limb of the flood pulse. And often that perturbation causes a huge rapid increase in biochemical oxygen demand, and that causes fish kills very frequently, but it's not really related to fire. Yeah, that's all I can say.
Thank you, Mike, for stepping in. Oh, I see a hand raised. The question was, how does the burning of peat beds affect the delta? And Mike's going to take that. Sorry, it should have been sat on. Maybe every month you should be there.
No. Badly is the short answer to that. The thing with peat is that it effectively raises the base level of the floodplain floors so that emergent vegetation can grow. Sorry?
Who doesn't know what peat is?
Oh, does everybody know what peat is? There was laughter over there, they know. Everybody's okay. Well, it's what? Yeah, thanks, Noel. It's old, relatively undecomposed plant matter. It's organic matter, and it accumulates in places where you've got slow but steady growth of plants in an anaerobic environment. So it needs to be saturated with water all the time. Otherwise, the decomposition process is much, much faster. But in the kind of papyrus and phragmites floodplains of the permanent swamps, it builds up very steadily, probably sort of at less than 1 millimeter a year. And what happens when you burn that is that you get a sudden drop in the effective surface of the earth from the surface water level to 1.5 or 2 meters down. And when that happens, it's very difficult for aquatic plants to become re-established because they've got 2 meters of water absorbing all the light. And so we don't want peat fires. The other thing that peat fires do is what all of you guys did this evening by driving here. They add incredible amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. Yes, indeed, me too. One of the really important things about wetlands is that they sequester carbon. As long as we can keep them wet, they are huge carbon stores, and we need to try and avoid the peat fire problem, not only because of the whole change of relief and the resetting of ecological succession that goes on there, but also because we've got a duty to try and keep as much of the carbon in the ground as we possibly can. Thanks. Emily, come back. Save me.
Thanks, Mike, for stepping in when you apparently a fire expert as well. Great, yes. Peat fire's bad. Anyone? Sorry, just for anyone who didn't hear that, is how does fire affect termites?
I don't know, so I'm passing to Lynn.
And I don't know either. But I think really what I wanted to say is that this is one of the biggest gaps is that most of the studies that have been done on the impacts of fire are very localized, very short term. And so that's kind of why this whole idea of having a concept note that we get funding for hopefully a 6-7 year program to study fire properly would do. However, I do want to kind of just give a guess on that, Brad, and also say my favorite thing is, which is it depends. A lot of the fires that move through savannas move through very, very rapidly, and so that the temperature issue on a termite mound where most of the colony, for want of a better word, is deeply underground, is probably very limited. And they might have a setback of limited forage, or whatever you call it when it's a termite, for some time. the biggest impact of fires really is when they are slow and deep and affect the soil. We don't see that a lot in the sandy savannas. We don't know what's happening in clay areas associated with some of the floodplains on the edges of the Okavango. But there's also probably less vegetation there to burn. If I think about like Nokoneng Flats, for example. So I would say termites are probably fairly resilient to fire. Thanks.
Mike wants to just add to that.
Food. I think fires are competing with termites for food. And so from that point of view, I think they're probably pretty important. We can just picture a huge battle going on out there for little bits of carbon. And that's what's happening when fire steals food from termites. It makes life tougher for them, and they're probably more likely to come and eat your house.
Okay. Okay, the question is, are there any immediate recommendations from the panel that people should or should not follow?
Unfortunately, Mr. Reditapo is not here. He'd obviously be able to give the DFR, the current policy recommendations on what people should or shouldn't be doing. Effectively, one of the recommendations to any new development, any existing development within the Delta is you have a fire break. They have specific guidelines on how that fire break should be established, the size of it, the width of it, etc. As well as DFR, I know, offer training for staff or individuals in that landscape.
Yeah, so here we go. I'm going to say it depends again. In savannas, there's a lot of work that's been done. So we do know what the recommendations are for sort of landscape level managing, particularly when you live in places that are no longer. We might like to imagine that northern Botswana is a wilderness, but in fact, the human impact is so huge and it's not as wild as we like. There is this recognition that we need to work with fire and not suppress it. And that's why most of the concessions have fire management programs, and we're trying to get back into a sort of a prescribed fire system again. In the savannas, the Australians have done a lot of work with this, and it includes working with Indigenous people and bringing them in, and they're not just as participants in fire management activities, but also their knowledge. And the idea is that in savannas, you want to do burning in the early dry season. So here that would be May, June. And the reason for that is that you get this patch mosaic effect, which is exactly speaks to all of the stories of landscape heterogeneity that we mentioned previously, and landscape diversity, and that you also can control the spread of the fire much better, and it's less destructive. It doesn't necessarily take out everything or burn as deeply because the fires are less intense, so you probably have less trees dying. In terms of the Delta, it is a huge gap. And so what to recommend for the Okavango, I think the recommendations would be for concessionaires to really speak to their staff, or if they are working in community areas. And I think that it's quite telling because it's one of those things that didn't go, can go right to the top slide. That a lot of the burning that is being taken place is in community managed areas. And this is because people truly believe that fire is good. So if you have a look at NG12, there's a cattle grazing area happening there. You look at NG32, those are the two kind of main community areas. So how do you work with people to say, we understand you want to burn, but we need to think about when and where. So in terms of the recommendations, it's mostly for government to say, come on, let's try and roll out a practice where we encourage communities to not do it in secret and to not do it as individuals, but collectively. And I know that this is where things are heading. And again, it would have been nice if Mr. Tapa was here because he could speak to some of the community-based fire management initiatives that are being rolled out. Because the community concession areas are as also have fire management plans, just as the tourist ones do. So that, I mean, that's really it, is to try and bring the burning out of the dark secret corners and talked about and planned. That's the key recommendations that I can think of for now until we change our laws.
And I think that's really important, because if everything's illegal, if you light a fire and you run away, you have no idea what happens to it. Whereas if things are planned and under management, then you can work out when and where and how often and who, and have a contingency in case it gets out of hand. Which is the idea. Any other hands waving around?
Richard Finn from Okavango Research Institute. Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Lynn on that point, in that I see one of the biggest problems in managing natural resources is that if communities are excluded, you're going to see a lot of problems, because they will always feel left out, and they may even resist activities. So, for example, one of the reasons why these community areas burn a lot is because, first of all, there's not enough rights devolved to communities in terms of management rights and decision-making rights. And as Lynn mentioned, the collective rights is that once communities can form proper management institutions that work towards developing rules for management, which is always what communities did in the past. They always had a traditional system, traditional institutions that managed these resources, and the chief might have overseen that, and then they would develop rules about, okay, we're going to burn this area this year and that area next year, and I don't want to see any fires in this area, and that's how it would have worked. But now you take away the control from the chiefs, you take away the control from the communities, now it just becomes a free-for-all. So we'll never see a fire management plan implemented until you have proper community control in their local areas, and that they can develop their own rules and feel that they have some hand in the management of fire.
I actually have a question. You showed that lovely, really interesting map about how often fires burnt in areas. Do you know if there is, I know it depends, but is there sort of an optimal interval of fire?
So the best studies that have been done in the broad landscape indicates a fire interval of 5 to 7 years, or a little bit longer. But Lynn is going to contradict me, so I'm going to pass it over.
I think the question is, it depends on the ecosystem. So if you are trying to get tree growth, you might want to reduce the frequency of fire. But if you want to keep it an open grassland, then more frequent fires are probably better. So every 3 years, maybe every 3 to 5 years. We don't have exact data, but your management objective, especially on whether you want to lean to an open area or a wooded area, will depend on it. But for the woodland areas, especially the Baikya-Berkya regions in the northern part of the country, extreme north, they do not need frequent fire. They would, as that Norwegian study put it, 5 to 7 years for that. But perhaps in grassy floodplains, it could tolerate it more often if it is not too dry. Thanks. So the question is, how far back does traditional fire management go? I'm not sure, because the Okavango has been used by Bushmen or San people for a very, very long time. But the people of the so-called Bantu groups, whether it is the Botswana, the Baye, Hambakushu, have come much more recently to this area, so only in the last 300 years. So I don't know if the Bushmen or San used fire in the same way in the floodplains. Perhaps they did in the drier areas like Chief's Island, for hunting here and there. But I would say in the broader part of northern Botswana, a sharp kind of uptick in fire probably in the last 300 years. That's just a guess. So, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Lynn. And yeah, just to wrap up, there are online resources which are on the screen, which anybody, as if you're interested, you can go and look at these websites, and they provide real-time data on where fires are all over the world. So obviously we're focused on northern Botswana, so you can kind of zoom in and see. You can look at a time frame existing, what's happening today, what's happened in the 2-3 days previously, and certainly as operators for camps, for tourism operators, I'm sure nearly all of you guys are familiar with these resources, and you've spent time looking at them, and you watch them. Certainly when we get more into the fire season, September, October, and you're watching the fires approaching, or are they approaching, or which way is the wind pushing them, that sort of thing. So these resources are available. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to have any licenses to go and look at them. They're freely available for you to kind of go see what's happening and understand for yourself in real time what's happening with the landscape, especially if you see that there's a fire and you want to see how it's progressing, or you want to see the impact that it might be having.
Thank you to all of you for joining us and for your interesting questions, comments, discussions. They're still here. You can find them at any point and bombard them with information or requests. The bar's still open. Thank you to our sponsors, supporters, Okavango Craft Brewery, Okavango Research Institute, and Kwando Safaris. And we will see you all next time. Have a lovely evening.